The Bedford Historical Society Speaker Series is supported in part by the residents of Cuyahoga County through a public grant from Cuyahoga Arts and Culture. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Cuyahoga Arts and Culture or the Bedford Historical Society. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the February Speaker Series. So tonight we have Becky Johnson giving us a Washington love story, George and Martha Washington. Let's welcome Becky Johnson.
What a nice looking group. I'm sure you're all George Washington fans, right? Martha Washington fans? Good. And if you can't hear me, let me know, because my voice is kind of airy, and I want to be sure you can hear all the wonderful details I'm going to tell you about George and Martha. I want to thank you first for letting me come and talk about one of my favorite things to talk about, which is our first president. We all have heard of George Washington, and I want you to close your eyes for a minute and imagine George Washington is standing in front of you, okay? He's probably one of the most recognized people in American history. He had many portraits made, a life mask, sculptures, sketches, but there are no photographs. He was about 6'3" and a half at his death. He weighed about 200 pounds. He walked ramrod straight. He was athletic, powerful, and graceful. A thick torso, long arms and legs, wide hips, and very thick thighs, and a lot of people thought he had a big butt. He had size 13 shoes. His eyes were indicative of deep thoughtfulness. He had an oval face, a large nose, blue-gray eyes, reddish-brown hair that eventually all turned white, and pale skin that sunburned easily. He didn't smile much because of his teeth, as we all know. He lost his first tooth at age 24, and the last one when he was president. It came out. That was because of poor genes and poor medical treatments. Most people thought he was acceptable, but not handsome. And we all know his picture from the quarter, the dollar bill, etchings and pictures from everywhere. We're not going to talk about things tonight that you learned in school. We're going to talk about more interesting things. We're not going to talk about the throwing of the coin across the Potomac, which really never happened. We're not going to talk about the cherry tree, which really never happened. We're talking about true things. Okay? One of the things I want to talk, we're going to talk a little bit about him, then we'll talk a little about her, then we'll talk about how they got together. This is Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson selected Houdin, who was the most famous sculptor of the time, and said, we want you to come and do a statue of George Washington. He didn't want to come. He said, I'm going to die in the sea. So they promised him 10,000 liras if he lived, because if he didn't, or if he died, they would send it all to his family. So in 1785, he came over. He took measurements, all kinds of measurements. Took him a couple months, and then he did a life mask of George's face, which makes this one of the most remarkable things because it's very much true to likeness. He completed it, and he sent it back to the United States 11 years later, because as you remember, we had a lot going on at that time. He had 6 of them were commissioned. They went to North Carolina State Capitol, South Carolina State Legislature House, Lafayette Park in St. Louis, New York City Hall, the Virginia Military Institute, and actually there is one at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio right now. There was a fire in North Carolina, and so they used the same cast and they asked for some more. And those went to the U.S. Capitol Rotunda now has one. Philadelphia has one. If you go to Valley Forge, it's sitting right next to the house that he stayed in his headquarters. Inside Washington Monument, and at Trafalgar Square in London. They wanted one too. He is wearing a revolutionary uniform, but he's holding a civilian walking cane. Behind him is a plowshare indicating he was a farmer and that agriculture was our nation's strength. His left hand rests on a column representing civilian authority. There are 13 rods in that podium indicating the 13 colonies. His sword leans against the column next to his cape, showing that independence had been gained. It's a wonderful thing. This is my favorite picture of him by Rembrandt Peale. And if you've been seeing the White House at all lately, you'll see the originals hanging there. So, Kevin Hayes was biking in Australia and he was camping. A couple who was next door to him said, "Why don't you come over and talk to us? We've never met any Americans and we've never been to America." And he said, "Okay." So he came over and they said, "Only thing we've ever heard about America is George Washington. So tell us everything you know about him." And so Kevin said, "Well, he was our first president." And that was about all Kevin knew. So what Kevin did, though, was truly amazing when he came back. He decided he would learn about George Washington in a very unusual way. He went to his library, and they gave him access. George had about 900 books and pamphlets and articles and written things, because back then, when you published something, you wanted the president to have it, so you would mail it to him. And George was very famous, so he got everybody sent him things. He wanted a large library because that improved his social standing. What Kevin did was he witnessed his signature as he started out as a very young child, all the way through to when after he was president. And he saw at 16 years old what his handwriting was like. George had copied 110 rules of civility, which I'm sure many of you have memorized. Sleep not while another is speaking is one of them. Speak not evil of the absent, for it is unjust. And don't gnaw on your nails. Were just 3 of them. It was customary to take and sign the plate when you got a book, you signed the faceplate with the date, how much the book cost, and your signature. And that's what he found a lot of when he saw it changing over the years as he became a man and grew up. So George Washington, of course, had a copy of the Constitution, and he wrote in the margins of it. In 1789, he wrote all over it. It was auctioned off at Christie's in New York in 2016. How much do you think it went for? $9.8 million. And who bought it? Mount Vernon bought it. Yeah, it's on sale now. He didn't write a lot in it, mostly about the president section is what he wrote in about. Well, let's talk about Martha. And isn't this a much nicer picture of a young Martha Washington? She was born just after midnight on June 2nd, 1731, in an upstairs bedroom at home. Her home was called Chestnut Grove, and it was on 500 acres, a plantation that had a 2-story house, 3 rooms on each floor. Martha was the first child of John and Frances Dandridge. She later would have 3 brothers and 4 sisters, 3 of which died when they were all very young. Her ancestor was the first vicar of Bruton Parish in Williamsburg, which I don't know if many of you have ever been to Bruton Parish. I think probably you have. Her father, John, was a British citizen who came to America to make his fortune in tobacco. He owned about a dozen slaves. So Martha grew up, and her mother taught her in the things that she needed to know back then, in the early 1700s, how to run a kitchen, how to cook meals for her family, how to make drinks, produce clothes on a spinnet, sew by hand, study the Bible, and learn of crude medicines, which she carried throughout her whole life. Martha only went to 4 or 5 years of schooling in a 1-room schoolhouse with a teacher. She learned math, reading, writing with grammar, music lessons, and dancing. She learned to ride horses and lawn bowling. But dancing was a major form of entertainment back then. At 15 years old, her parents said, "It's time we get you married off." So they sent her to the Williamsburg balls. She didn't meet anyone she liked there. She just didn't. But she did catch the eye soon of Daniel Parke Custis, who was 35 years old. She was 15. Daniel's grandfather, John, was a real character. He went back and forth to England, and he had 2 sets of families, one in the islands, Caribbean, and one in Virginia. And he was not a happily married man, shall we say. Well, they had 4 children, and 2 of them died. And one of them was Daniel Parke Custis, who would marry Martha. After Daniel Parke's mom died, the dad got the estate, and he had to pay all the debts, including the illegitimate children that his family and his father had at Leeward Island. The court battle for that took 50 years to settle. It's called the Dunbar suit. So John Custis, Daniel's father, did not like Martha. He didn't think she was good enough. She was from the wrong kind of family. She didn't have enough money. He just didn't care for it all. Daniel had one sister that had lived to adulthood, and she had had many chances to marry, but her father didn't want her to marry, and he had each time ruined it. So finally she said, I don't care, I'm going to get married. And then he disowned her and disinherited her. So John vowed to disinherit Daniel if he married Martha. John said, I will leave everything to mulatto Jack, which was his illegitimate son that he had freed. And so Daniel said, I really want to marry Martha. She's just wonderful. And so he had his friends all go and talk to his father, and he had Martha go and talk to his father. There's a story about how she got mad at him, he got mad at her, and she threw the silver out in the street and said, I don't care about the money, I really love your son. And eventually the father said, okay, you can marry him. She's spirited. So he gave his blessing. Unfortunately, he died 2 months later before they could get married. I guess it's unfortunate. They married on May 15th, 1750. Martha moved into Daniel's home. Does anybody know the name of his home? It's called the White House, the White House Plantation. 17,000 acres, 200 slaves. But his father's will had said two stipulations. One is the descendants must be named Park. They would not get 1 penny of the money that was in the family inheritance, which is why they all have Park as a middle name. He also stipulated that Mulatto Jack would get a sizable land grant, a house that was already built, and money annually. And they said, okay. So Jack moved in with Martha and Daniel and lived for a while. Then he became very sick, and within 24 hours, he too died. So Martha and Daniel had 4 children. They had Daniel Park in 1751, Francis in 1753, and they both died in infancy. Then she had John, called Jackie. Remember how back then everybody's got 2 or 3 names? In 1754, and then they had Martha, called Patsy, in 1756. So Martha has 2 children that die. She has her father die. She has her father-in-law die. And it's just a very, very hard thing for her. Okay? Good. And at this point, she has a critical thing that becomes such a part of her personality, and that is to spoil her children because she doesn't want to lose any more. So whatever they wanted, that was fine. She was a very much an easy pushover, I guess. Very protective, but very much wanted them to have it. Well, then Daniel, her husband, he comes along. They've been married about 7 years, and he dies. Her son Jackie had been sick with the same sickness, and the doctor had come and given the father and the son the medicine. The son recovered, and that's when her husband died. Martha now had to run the plantation, and a woman couldn't get on her own. She couldn't act in legal situations at that time, but needed a man as a surrogate. So a friend stepped up to help her with tobacco sales, and she stepped in to manage it all. The problems that she faced were the Dunbar suit was still costing lots and lots of money to settle. John Custis's Williamsburg home had to be tended to, so she had her brother move in there while he went to William and Mary. Daniel had had no will, so everything went to Martha. And also her sister, who is 13 years old, passes away then too. I know, she's had a lot of sadness. And here's a quote from her. I have learned from experience that the greater part of our happiness or misery depends upon our disposition and not upon our circumstances, which is a lot for somebody who's lost so much. Well, she wanted to marry again. Here she's the 3rd wealthiest person in Virginia. She wants to marry again. So along comes many suitors, but there were 2 in particular. One was Charles Carter. He was the son of Robert King Carter, who was the wealthiest planter in Virginia. The trouble was, he too was 20 years older than Martha. Martha thought, I've been there. And also, he had some children. He had 12 children, 10 of which would be coming with him when they got married. So Martha finally said, I don't think this is right for me. That's not it. So on March 5th, 1758, she decides to go to an afternoon social at her friend's house, William Chamberlain's home, which were her childhood friends. Be sure I got this right. Well, I'm going to switch to George for a minute. So George is sick. He was kind of a bit of a hypochondriac in some ways. So he goes to the doctor. Oh, it's terrible, terrible. And the doctor says in Williamsburg, it's still dysentery, because he thought he had tuberculosis. You're going to be fine. Just get rest and relax. And he's coming away from his regiment to go to the doctor. So he said, okay, I want to take a minute to say something about Sally Fairfax. Does anybody know who she is? She is the notorious hopeless flirt that lived next door. And she was one of his best friend's wife. And she would write letters to him and was not happy at all. After they announced the engagement to Martha, he was not happy at all. And I think there's a whole bunch of, I don't think anything happened is what I want to say. I think, she was a flirt, and she eventually moves over to England and he tries, but she writes these letters that are not tasteful, I guess. So on the way home from Williamsburg, George decides to stop and visit his friend, William Chamberlain. Martha had come to spend that afternoon. They're both 27 at this time. Now, Martha was not quite 5 feet tall. She was kind of plump, slightly plump. She had tiny hands, an oval face, a small mouth, a high forehead, and a rounded chin. People called her a pocket Venus. She had beautiful white teeth. She had brown hair and hazel eyes, but she was somewhat plain looking. One of the people who knew her then said she possessed an ineffable charm that made a man dream of comfort and home and the peace of his own fireside with her at her side. She was not educated much. She rarely read books. Her penmanship was illegible, and her spelling was atrocious. But she had charm, because her charm was her personality. She was friendly, compassionate, vitally interested in you. She shared the joys of birth and marriage and grieved with you when people died. She loved to talk of family and children. She conversed easily on everyday topics. People were drawn to her because of her cheerful disposition. She loved beautiful clothes, ornate carriages, good food, especially sweets. She loved cookies and cakes and candies, and elegant houses. She was very refined. Well, they had probably met before because they traveled somewhat in the same social circles, but they'd never really talked. So they talk, and they talk all during the day. They talk into the evening. The chaperones go to bed. They talk almost all night. He stays and he's like, this is her. This is the one that I want to marry. And by then, she is completely smitten too. The next day he says, I'll come back. And a week later, he comes back again and spends the whole day. They just talk, talk, talk. It was just wonderful. It seems clear that Patsy, which is what Martha went by, Patsy fell passionately in love with George almost immediately and decided to please herself in this second marriage. She didn't lose her head completely. She took the time to get to know him better before making her final decision. She discovered an honorable gentleman who would never embarrass her, a kind man who would love the children, hers and theirs, a man faithful to his word who would safeguard the Custis inheritance. His lack of fortune needn't have concerned her since she had plenty of money for them both. She was also a woman confident of her own allure, unafraid of rivals for his affection. In George Washington, she saw a man with whom she believed she could live longly, lovingly, and happily, and she was right. So they talk and talk. He comes back again. So later in March. The first week of May, he comes and he spends a long time there, gets to know the kids, gets to know everybody else, and he orders a ring from Philadelphia. He proposes and she accepts. In a letter from July 20th, they met again, and then they didn't meet again until the last week of December, when they planned their wedding. Their wedding was to be January 6, 1759. January 6 was called Twelfth Night, the end of the holiday season, and a holiday alone, a time of dinners, parties, and dancing. When they got married, George wore an elegant blue cloth suit with white satin waistcoat, new shoes with big gold buckles, and white dress gloves. Martha got her outfit from London. She wore an elegant gold damask dress with white lace and silver threads, purple satin high heels, slippers with metallic thread, sequins, and pearl jewelry. And I actually, if you want to come up later, I have a picture of those shoes. Now, remember, they're a long time. It's a long time ago. They don't look very purple, but they're there. She later made a handkerchief out of parts of her petticoat as a memento. Martha arrived in an elegant horse-drawn carriage. George rode in on a horse given to him by General Braddock. The reception was at the White House. They danced until late into the evening, and then the reception continued for 3 days. That really was a party. There was no honeymoon. They stayed at White House for 2 to 3 months. They only left one time to go into Williamsburg. The last week of March, they packed up and they decided they would go to their new home, which was Mount Vernon. The relationship was deep and mutual. This is about Martha. Her deep devotion to her children and other family members paled before the burning intensity of her love for George. He accepted her adoration without much thought. It was the atmosphere in which he breathed and lived, where he was most himself. She was at his side and on his side, sympathizing and supporting him through depression, failure, disloyalty, anxiety about the future. With her, he didn't need to pretend that he had to be perfect. So here he is, all this is going on, and she is just the one that really he wanted to spend time with. So George asked Martha to come live with him at headquarters, which she does. And if you've been to Valley Forge, you'll see that's, they have a room, and then there's all these guys and 3 and 4 to a bed and all over the place. Martha softened him and gave him a sounding board. She started doing things with the other wives, and they raised $300,000. Yes, $300,000, and then they made shirts for all the people. This is what she's doing. She's knitting socks, she's knitting hats, she's doing all kinds of things. George Washington was the indispensable man to the success of the American Revolution, and Martha Washington was the indispensable woman to him. He could bear all those years away from home, creating a national army, because she spent part of every year with him, no matter how awful the conditions were. Their mutual love, confidence, and support helped keep him going in the face of every disappointment, setback, and defeat. Each year she made a home for him where he could rest and refresh his spirit before going back out in the field, however long it took to win that war. Out of those 8.5 years that he was away, she spent almost 5 years with him. More than half the war, it still ranging from 3 to 10 months visit. Martha was truly the secret weapon of the American Revolution. So after they win, he returns his commission, and then he goes back to Mount Vernon. And we all know he gets called back into public service. She did not want him to be president. She felt he had done his job, but he felt he had to do it. And so he went back, first 1 term, then a 2nd term. Then she kind of puts her foot down and says, enough, And so he retires, actually just 2 years before he dies. 8 years, during those 8 years while he's president, they have balls and receptions. She's very lonely because she gets to see him, but every day they had people. You could just go to the White House and see the president. And everybody did. And they had a thing called levees, and every week people would come and just talk to him about everything. She was very aware of being the first of everything. So George was too. Everything they did, they knew was being for posterity. They had to be very careful what they did. And she was very, very careful. So they finally get to go back to Mount Vernon in 1797. They had lots of happy times. They had adopted 2 of their grandchildren, Nellie and Wash. And it was a really nice time. He would go out every morning after he had his honey cakes and dipped in honey, and he would go out and ride around all of his properties. He was out riding in December, and he got drenched because it was a terrible snowstorm and wet too. When he came back in, his voice was a little scratchy, and she said, "Oh, you should go and change." And he goes, No, I'll be okay. I'll wait and change after dinner. Well, they ate the dinner. He said, "I don't want to keep anybody waiting." They ate the dinner, and then they went and read newspapers, and Tobias Lear was his secretary. And he was there, and they were reading and reading. And it was at the time they had wanted George to be governor of Virginia. They had wanted him to be lead the army if they needed one, and he had agreed to that. So it's very heated political things. But he said, "I just don't feel good. I'm just going to go to bed." So he goes to bed, and the next day he can hardly talk, all during the night. They call for the doctors. The doctors use leeches and bleed him 4 times, and they don't know what to do. His throat is just about closed. He can hardly talk at all. And he dies. The last thing he did, though, was try and take his own pulse. He kept saying, "You'll be okay," but this is obviously, I'm going to die from this. He asked Martha to get the two wills that he had written, and she destroys one in the fire, and he gets one that they use. And in that will, he frees all of his slaves. He couldn't free her dowager slaves, but he freed all of his slaves. Martha moved to the 3rd floor that night after he died. She closed his study, and she closed their bedroom, and she went upstairs and lived for about 2.5 more years. She did not go to the funeral. She just couldn't take it. She felt that the United States has taken so much from her that she wanted that time to herself. So afterwards, when she had recovered a little bit, she had 2 miniatures made, one of herself and one of George Washington. On the reverse of her miniature, she had it ornamented by 67 pearls, which was his age at his death, and the inscription, "Joined by friendship and crowned by love," which is the thing they always had together. I want to tell you a couple things we have here you want to look at, and then we have a couple questions, okay? You're a very serious group. As I said, she was so small. If you go to Mount Vernon, you can see she's really very small. This is one of the kids. Those are just some statues there. I don't even know how many books. I have all of them, I think. I really do. This is about his mother. He had a really tough time with his mother. She was very stern, and she even wrote to Congress one time and said, "I'm not getting enough money. My son is winning the war, and you need to send me more money." This is just a wonderful one. We'd gone to Mount Vernon, and I heard him speak. It's a wonderful one. Here's one about his spy ring, the Secret Six, and it is masterful, the spy ring. They said, King George said, they didn't win, they just outspied us, because it was amazing, if you want a good read on how we really won the war. This is the book I'm finishing up now. It's on Washington's End. It's what happens after he gets out of the presidency. And then You Never Forget Your First. Somebody gave it to me as a joke, but it's really a good book. It's really very fun. And Jack has some things here, a very old book, and then he has a letter that you can see his signature. At our home, Brett got me for Christmas one of George Washington's signature, and it's about 4 feet by 2 feet. So every night I try to pretend like I can write like him. My daughter, our daughter, isn't that adorable? A little ponytail too and everything. She had made that for him. And then just have a couple things. But this year for Christmas, I got this. These are buttons. Now, I don't know if they're replica or not. That doesn't matter to me because they're wonderful. If you go to the Revolutionary War Museum in Philadelphia, you will see that these buttons, and these are the things that really, they were inaugural buttons that they had, and they're very delicately designed. They're very, very beautiful. So, did we have any questions?
Talk to us about the spy ring.
Oh, yes.
What was going on?
Well, this is one for young readers. It's just a wonderful thing. It had it so that there were 5 people. In fact, I have that written down. 5 people. One of them has never been identified. They had the Culper spy ring, which Culper was a name of where he was born around in Virginia. And because George said, they've got the best military, they've got might, they've got the Navy against a ragtag army. So we thought we have to do something. So we got a reserved merchant, a tavern keeper, a brash young longshoreman, a curmudgeon Long Island bachelor, a coffee house owner, and a mysterious woman that we still don't know who she was. None of them knew who anybody else was in the whole thing. They could add intelligence and route, like it would come like from here to Columbus. In Columbus, they'd pick it up and they'd send it over to Pennsylvania, and somebody would take it. And then, so nobody knew who they went through 6 things until it got to him. They used invisible ink, where you write like with juice, and then you can take a heat and it will come out. They had an alphabetical code that had 763 words, and it was really amazing what they did. They really, they just found out he was going to be attacked. They found out he was going to be assassinated. There was one point in the war where a brand new sniper from England had George Washington in his sights, and he said, "Boy, that man carries himself so well. I don't think I'll kill him." And here he had no idea it was George Washington that would have been all over. But those people were just amazing. They just really were dedicated. They never talked. They never said anything about it. And they had to do a lot of research to find out who they are.
So was it Washington's idea to start the ring, or did somebody else start the ring and he just let it up, or what was?
It was his idea to start it.
So he was hands-on with this? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was just, yeah. Very. But it's a wonderful, wonderful book. Yeah. Did anybody have, yeah?
2 questions. Did he ever have his teeth fixed? And did they have children together?
No, they never had children together. He had gone, when his brother was sick with tuberculosis, he had gone down to, one of the islands, I forget which one it was. And George went with him. The only time he left American soil, he went down there with him. That was the man who owned Mount Vernon. And he came back and he died anyways. But when George was down there, he got smallpox, and they think that that's made him sterile. That's why he couldn't have children. But George died believing that he could. If she died first, I'm going to get another wife, and I think I'll have kids. But it wasn't in the cards. And what was your first question? His teeth, yeah. Poor thing. Just terrible, the teeth. There were 4 sets, some are at the Smithsonian, and they had they had ivory, they had some animal teeth, they had some slave teeth that he bought from the slaves. I don't know how much, but most of them were animal teeth, and they had a clamp. And he had to fit it in there and clamp and talk, and it was just really hard for him to eat anything in that. And the fact that he was so tall at a time when people weren't that tall, and he was just so Abigail Adams just loved him, and she couldn't say enough nice things. But then as John got jealous of him, because everything's Washington, he got jealous of him, then she didn't care so much about him then. Yeah.
The America he ruled over really didn't go that far west in this country. What, Mississippi is that?
Yeah.
The frontier was,
Yeah.
pretty far east, Couldn't have been much farther than
Oh, and this, yeah.
Mississippi River.
This is another presence. This is, Rand McNally made a map of every place he's been.
That's it.
This is it. And so when people say he was in Northfield, I'll say, no, he wasn't in Northfield. He went to Marietta, was his close. He did own property in Ohio for a long time. But these are all the places he went. What he did was, on the summers, he would take, when Congress wasn't in session, he would take and go on a trip. And one year he went to every one of the South, to the places down south, all the colonies. One year he went up north and stuff. Now remember, it's not like he's riding this rickety old carriage that's breaking down everywhere. And so I have a book that reenacts it. And they talk about how he went there. But that was really nice of him to go everywhere. He would just want to listen to the people and hear what they had to say. He was against political parties completely. He was a Federalist, but he wouldn't have told you that. He said no, because he didn't like political parties. He thought it would be the death of America. So, word of the wise. So.
Do you know who painted the painting up there on the TV screen? I only ask because he's got this 80s blue eyeshadow thing on.
I don't know. So does she. Yeah, I don't think she wore blue eyeshadow. No, I don't. No, I don't.
All right.
No, sorry.
Yeah, how is all this information acquired? So, there's a lot of from back that long ago was a lot of information or was all detailed.
That's a good question. George was very much took notes on everything. Well, just about everything. He didn't write a whole lot about Sally Fairfax, but he took notes on everything. I have a copy of his will, and I also have a copy of his ledger. And I mean, if he spent 3 cents buying a peppermint, it would be in his ledger. But because Martha was an atrocious speller, and so was he. And he felt bad because everybody else, Jefferson, everybody else had these wonderful degrees. And, you know, Adams from New England, and here he didn't. So he was ashamed of it. And so he had secretaries who came and would help him rewrite and correct the spelling in his letters and stuff. Vast amounts of writing. That's why Alexander Hamilton was so good. And when he was a secretary to him, he would write it, and George would say, okay, that's what I want. He would explain it to him ahead of time. But we have lots and lots of records. In fact, one of his dying wishes was, please continue and correct all those spellings and get the papers in order so that they have them all. It's called the Papers of George Washington, and it's at Mount Vernon, and it's really...
And Martha, she kept diaries or something like that, or was that?
No, Martha, not really, because Martha, I mean, the spelling was really pretty rough for Martha. Sometimes he would dictate to her, she would write it down, then he would give it to his secretary to copy over, because it was hard. And then all of their love letters, she said, it's not for anyone but me. And she burned them all after he died, except for one that was in the back of a dresser. So, but yeah, it's kind of sad. But all of his other letters, yeah.
I think that Sally was the female spy.
I don't think so, because she left when the war started.
She could have come back.
She could have. I don't care very much for Sally, can you tell? A lot of people want to make something out of it, but I don't think it's there. But yeah, she left. Yeah.
In the beginning, we were talking about a life mask. Is that what you were talking about? All these places where they were?
The life mask.
Where they ended up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I thought it was very ironic that one went all wound up in England of all things.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I went to Miami University, and then I get this thing thinking, I never saw that when I was there, because it was put away for a while, but it's there, which is strange to be at a university. But he signed the paperwork that allowed Miami to be founded in 18...
Who's got the original? Do we know?
Well, there were several made from the cast. So there were, I think, 5.
The very first cast made. They saved that.
Yeah, they saved it. That's how they made the second cast.
They gave it to somebody?
The cast? I don't know where the cast
I mean,
is.
the original.
Well, they made it out of bronze. So once they made the cast, that's when they made, I think, 6 copies of it to begin with. That's like, when he put his hand on for the first inauguration and he swears on his Constitution. Where do you think that Bible is? It was a Masonic Bible, and the Masons of New York still have it. They won't give it to anyone. They won't give it to the Smithsonian or anything. Yeah?
A friend of mine today, I was telling her we were coming, and said that she had seen some sort of something on TV, like a documentary or something, where George had a love interest long before he met Martha that had gone on for a while, but was like kind of I don't know, like nobody ever did anything about it.
Yeah, there were 2 people before. One was an heiress, but she wasn't interested. Her last name was Felipe. She just wasn't interested in him. And there was another one that he liked, but nothing ever happened with that. He was a teenager. So, yeah.
Did anyone ever trace their genealogy? Like, are they both of English descent, or does anyone know?
Are they both, pardon?
Their genealogy. Did anyone ever trace?
Oh, yeah. And it's in one of the books. I'm not sure if I brought it or not. It's because George's obviously ends with him. He doesn't have any children. But Martha's go on. And Martha has a grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. And he couldn't go to school. He just didn't want to. George kept saying, come on, try a little harder. And he just wouldn't. And he was just always more interested in everything else. After George and Martha died, he took George's uniforms and he would dress up in them and parade through towns and do all kinds of things to cash in on his name. His daughter married Robert E. Lee. And that's how they went to Arlington House. You know, that's what he lived. He lived there, and that's how they got into that. Yeah, but there's lots of genealogy about him. I looked up the closest living relative to George. I think he's an attorney in Texas. So, yeah.
Where was he born?
He was born at, I almost got a little dish. He was born at Ferry Farm, which is,
United States.
yes. And that he had been, his relatives had been several generations here, but Ferry Farm. And then it was across, I'm thinking, it might be the Pamunkey River, but he went right down. In fact, he had a sister, Mildred, who died, and they buried her under this gold fence post. And then eventually he moves on. When his father dies when he's young. He's, the two older brothers, Augustine, the father, had 2 sons. And then his wife dies. So he marries Mary Ball, the difficult one, strong-willed. And they have 5 kids, and George is the first one of the second marriage. And so when the father dies, he gives George his land, but George takes it, but he really has his eye on Mount Vernon that his brother had gotten, and it worked out that he got that. So, yeah. Well, thank you very much. I appreciated this so much.